A lonely roadside motel, a traveling salesman, a crumbling marriage in the next room. You think you know where this story is headed, don't you? But then the words little pig, let me in turn this dark comedy into something far more sinister. A boar at the door, a marriage on the rocks, and a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. What happens when the absurd meets the horrifying? Welcome to Monsters, and the twisted tale of Bed and Boar. John, a traveling salesman, played by a young Steve Buscemi, checks into a low-budget motel on another uneventful trip. What begins as a quiet evening quickly turns chaotic as he overhears an explosive argument in the room next door. A couple is loudly hashing out their grievances, with Sue, the wife, played by Jodie Markle, seemingly at her wit's end. When Sue and John cross paths, their connection is instant. She's charming, vulnerable, and clearly searching for an escape. John, ever the opportunist, sees a chance for a little excitement in an otherwise boring trip. But this is no ordinary motel, and Sue's husband is no ordinary man. As the plot thickens, the phrase little pig, let me in brings an unexpected and surreal twist. The emergence of a monstrous boar. What follows is a bizarre mix of chaos, humor, and horror as John realizes he's in way over his head. By the episode's end, John's meddling in this fractured relationship comes at a grotesque cost. Drawing on Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment, Bed and Boar subverts the traditional fairy tale structure. While classic tales often present moral lessons about the dangers of external threats like wolves or witches, this story flips the script. The true danger lies not outside but within, inside the motel room, the marriage, and John's own choices. John's predicament aligns with Albert Camus' philosophy of the absurd. He enters a world where logic ceases to function. A boar responding to fairy tale rhymes defies all reason. In Camus' terms, John's struggle is the human condition, searching for meaning in a universe governed by chaos. The episode critiques humanity's timeless tendency to overreach, to desire what is forbidden despite the obvious risks. The tension between Sue and her husband speaks to repressed fears and unresolved conflicts. Their marriage, like the boar, is monstrous, a grotesque amalgamation of unmet needs and bottled rage. Each character reflects an aspect of the shadow self. John embodies the opportunistic shadow, Sue represents a longing for freedom, and the boar, a physical manifestation of their dysfunction, forces a reckoning with their darkest impulses. The toxic dynamic between Sue and her husband highlights anxious avoidant attachment patterns. Sue's emotional withdrawal and her husband's aggression create a destructive loop, and John's interference only exacerbates their dysfunction. Motels and horror often serve as transient liminal spaces, places where societal norms and physical realities begin to dissolve. In Bed and Boar, the motel is not just a setting but a character in it itself. It represents a crossroads for each of the characters, John, Sue, and her husband. For John, the motel is a waypoint on a monotonous journey as a traveling salesman, yet it becomes the stage where his ordinary life collides with the surreal and monstrous. His entry into the motel signals his unknowing descent into a world of chaos, temptation, and grotesque consequence. For Sue and her boar husband, the motel symbolizes their fractured relationship. Removed from the stability of home, their toxic dynamic is laid bare. The dilapidated motel reflects the decay of their marriage, a relationship that has long ceased to function in any meaningful way. Motels also evoke a sense of anonymity. They're places where people go to be forgotten, to shed their identities for a night. This allows the characters' darkest impulses to surface, unrestrained by societal expectations or personal accountability. The boar, central to the episode's surreal horror, carries significant symbolic weight. It embodies primal instincts and the destructive power of unchecked desires. Unlike a wolf, often a symbol of cunning or predation, the boar is grotesque, untamed, and unrefined, a reflection of humanity's baser instincts. In mythology and literature, boars are often associated with gluttony and violence. Here, the boar becomes a physical manifestation of the couple's marital strife and John's moral failings. Its monstrous appearance underscores the grotesque nature of their actions, the betrayal, deceit, and selfishness. The repeated use of the phrase little pig, let me in, reinforces the boar's fairy tale origins while twisting its meaning. In The Three Little Pigs, the wolf represents an external threat that tests the pig's preparedness. In Bed and Boar, the threat is internal. Sue and her husband's inability to confront their issues invites the monster into their lives. The concept of fate in Bed and Boar is deeply intertwined with absurdity. The episode suggests that even the most mundane actions, checking into a motel, overhearing an argument, can spiral into chaos. This reflects a broader philosophical view of life's unpredictability, where small choices lead to disproportionate consequences. John's decision to involve himself in Sue's life seems innocuous at first, but it sets off a chain reaction that culminates in grotesque violence. This aligns with the idea of cosmic irony, the universe operating on a logic that is incomprehensible and often cruel to those trapped within it. Fairy tales have long been used to impart moral lessons. Bed and Boar subverts this tradition by offering a narrative devoid of clear heroes or lessons. Instead, it uses the structure and language of fairy tales to highlight the absurdity and futility of the characters' actions. The phrase little pig, let me in" is both a nod to childhood stories and a mocking reminder of the characters' failures to recognize the stakes of their situation. By invoking a familiar narrative only to dismantle it, the episode challenges viewers to question the morality and logic often taken for granted in traditional storytelling. Each character in Bed and Boar struggles with their identity within the confines of their roles. John is the archetypal traveling salesman, a role that implies transience, opportunism. Sue is cast as the damsel in distress, but her motivations are far murkier than they initially appear, and her husband, meanwhile, oscillates between aggressor and victim, his monstrous transformation blurring the line between man and beast. This collapse of identity is mirrored in the boar, which defies categorization. Is it a literal monster, a metaphor, or a hallucination brought on by the character's collective dysfunction? The ambiguity of the boar's existence forces viewers to confront the fluidity of identity and the limitations of traditional archetypes in understanding human behavior. John's initial involvement in the couple's life stems from a position of voyeurism. As an outsider, he observes their argument from the safety of his motel room. He could have minded his own business and went about his life in a passive and inconsequential way. However, his decision to intervene transforms him from spectator to participant, exposing him to the dangers of their toxic dynamic. This theme echoes broader critiques of voyeurism and horror. By positioning the audience as voyeurs alongside John, the episode implicates viewers in the unfolding chaos. It asks whether our consumption of others' suffering, whether on screen or in real life, is truly harmless. The relationship between Sue and her husband lies at the heart of this episode's horror. Their dynamic is a study in resentment, miscommunication, and unfulfilled desires. Each character projects their dissatisfaction onto the other, creating a feedback loop of blame and hostility. The boar's emergence can be seen as the physical manifestation of their marital breakdown. It represents the unspoken grievances, buried anger, and unmet needs that have festered beneath the surface for years. In this sense, the episode suggests that unresolved conflict, whether in a marriage or within oneself, will eventually demand to be confronted, often in grotesque and destructive ways. The absurdity of a talking boar and the fairy tale references create moments of levity that make the eventual violence all the more jarring. This blend of humor and horror reflects the grotesque tradition, which thrives on the juxtaposition of the absurd and the horrific. By making viewers laugh before confronting them with terror, Bed and Boar destabilizes their expectations, keeping them off balance and completely engaged. The motel's cheap, transient nature also serves as a critique of consumerism and disposability. John's role as a traveling salesman ties him to a system that prioritizes profit and convenience over substance and stability. This theme is mirrored in his actions with Sue, which are transactional and superficial, lacking the depth and commitment needed to navigate her complex situation. Buscemi's performance hints at the quirky, offbeat roles he would later become famous for. His portrayal of John perfectly captures the blend of awkwardness and ambition that defines the episode's tone. Bed and Boar reminds us that horror doesn't always have to be deadly serious to be effective, and in The Monsters it often isn't, and it's still effective. By weaving dark humor with grotesque fairy tale elements in this episode, it delivered a tale that's as thought-provoking as it is absurd. So the next time you find yourself at a motel, maybe don't listen to your neighbors argue. Take a moment to reconsider your involvement, because in the world of monsters, there's always a boar lurking behind the door, waiting for someone foolish enough to let it in. Check out this video next.